The photograph was faded at the edges, the paper thin as a whisper, but Lillian Lockhart recognized herself in it. The moment Bernard Turner pressed it into her palm with those rough, calloused hands of his that had somehow stayed gentle through every hard year the frontier had thrown at him. "I kept this for you," he said softly, "because I always believed you would come back here." She had not expected that. She had not expected any of this. She had ridden into Redemption Creek on the back of a borrowed roan mare with nothing but a carpetbag full of secrets, and a heart that had been broken so many times she had stopped counting the pieces. She had told herself she was not coming back for Bernard Turner. She had told herself she was coming back for the land, for the deed her father had left her, for justice against the man who had stolen everything from her family 7 years ago. She had told herself a great many things on that long, dusty ride from Denver, and every single one of those things had been a lie she had practiced so carefully she had almost believed them herself. But the moment she walked through the door of the Silver Horn Saloon and saw Bernard standing at the bar with his back to her, the way his shoulders still carried that quiet, immovable strength, the way his dark hair had gone silver at the temples in a manner that suited him in ways that struck her as profoundly unfair, she knew she had been lying to herself the whole time. He had turned then as though he felt her arrival the way you feel a change in weather before you can see the clouds, and those gray eyes of his, the color of a February sky over the Rockies, had gone very still. "Lillian," he had said, just that, just her name, not a question, not a greeting. Just her name, spoken like a fact he had known was coming and had been preparing for anyway. And then he had reached into the inside pocket of his worn leather vest and pulled out the photograph. Now she stood holding it, her throat tight, her eyes burning with something she refused to call tears because Lillian Lockhart had not cried in front of another living soul in 7 years, and she was not about to start now. "You kept this," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "All this time." "All this time," he confirmed. He did not look away from her. Bernard Turner had always had that particular quality that unsettled her and attracted her in equal measure, the absolute stillness of a man who had decided long ago that he would not run from hard things. "Why?" she asked, and the word came out smaller than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment, the saloon noise filling the space around them, the clatter of glasses and the low murmur of men who had no idea they were standing at the edge of something enormous. "You know why," he said. And she did. God help her, she did. But knowing was the most dangerous thing in the world right now, because Lillian Lockhart had ridden into Redemption Creek with a dark past snapping at her heels, and a man named Clayton Voss looking for her, and falling back into Bernard Turner's orbit was the one thing that could get them both killed before the week was out. 7 years earlier, Lillian had been a different kind of woman. Or perhaps she had been the same woman in different circumstances, which amounted to the same thing and also to something entirely different. She had been 22 years old in the spring of 1876, the daughter of Gerald Lockhart, who owned one of the most promising cattle operations in all of Colorado Territory. The Lockhart Ranch sat in a wide, green valley east of Redemption Creek, fed by a cold river, and protected on 3 sides by Red Rock Canyon walls that made it defensible and beautiful in equal measure. Her father had built it from nothing, had come west from Ohio with her mother Clara and $20 in his coat pocket, and a stubbornness that made mountains look flexible, and he had turned that nothing into something real and lasting. Bernard Turner had come to work for her father in the spring of 1875, when Lillian was 21. He had ridden in from New Mexico Territory, 27 years old, with good references from a cattle operation down south and a quiet, competent manner that her father recognized immediately as the rarest kind of valuable. Gerald Lockhart hired him on the spot as his foreman, and within 6 months there was not a man on the ranch who would not have followed Bernard Turner into a burning building if he asked them politely. Lillian had noticed him the way you notice a fire at a careful distance, with the awareness that it is warm and alive and capable of doing serious damage if you step too close. She had kept that careful distance through the summer and into the autumn, during which time Bernard was respectful and professional and did not press her in any way, which she found both admirable and quietly maddening. It was October when the distance collapsed. She had been riding out to the north pasture to check on the fall calves, a job she had done 100 times, when her horse had thrown a shoe on the rocky ground and come up lame. Bernard had been working the fence line a quarter-mile away and had seen her predicament from a distance that should have been too far to read clearly, but he had ridden over anyway, dismounted, examined the horse with those careful hands of his, and then looked up at her from where he was crouched in the dust with an expression that was the most genuinely kind thing she had seen in a long while. "She will be all right," he had said. "She just needs to be walked back easy." "I know how to walk a lame horse," Lillian had said, a little sharper than she intended. "I know you do," he had said simply, and had not been offended, and had walked back beside her for the 45 minutes it took to reach the barn, and they had talked the entire way about things that were small and large in equal measure, about the creek level and the price of cattle in Denver, and whether the winter would be hard or mild, and somewhere in that walk something had shifted between them that could not be shifted back. By December, they had their first careful, tentative conversation that was not about the ranch at all. By February of 1876, Bernard had asked her father's permission to court her properly, and Gerald Lockhart, who was a practical man but not an unromantic one, had given it. They had 5 months together. 5 months that Lillian had spent the last 7 years carrying like precious cargo through every bad thing that had happened to her, pulling them out on dark nights, and examining them for comfort and finding that they still held light even when nothing else did. The thing that ended those 5 months was named Clayton Voss. Clayton Voss had come to Redemption Creek in the summer of 1876, representing a land and cattle consortium out of St. Louis, a group of Eastern investors who had decided that the West was an opportunity, and that the men who already lived and worked there were merely obstacles to be managed. He was smooth-talking and well-dressed, and had a particular talent for identifying what a man valued most, and then leveraging that knowledge into a negotiation. He had approached Gerald Lockhart in July with an offer to buy the ranch at a price that was technically fair on paper and deeply unfair in every other way, because what the offer did not account for was that the Lockhart ranch was Gerald's life's work and his legacy for his daughter, and the thing that had given shape and meaning to 25 years of punishing labor. Gerald had refused, politely, firmly, without ambiguity. Clayton Voss had smiled his smooth smile and said he understood completely and had left. And then the bad things had started. First it was the cattle. 20 head, gone in a single night from the north pasture, disappeared without tracks because someone had driven them across the creek and up the rocky canyon, where the ground would not hold prints. Then it was the water rights, a legal challenge filed in the territorial court that was demonstrably fraudulent but expensive and time-consuming to fight. Then it was Gerald Lockhart himself, who had gone into town one evening in August and had never come home, found the next morning at the bottom of a creek bed with his neck broken, ruled an accident by a sheriff named Dalton, who had very suddenly begun wearing new boots and spending more time at the hotel where Clayton Voss was staying. Lillian had known. She had known with the bone-deep certainty that required no proof and found no justice. She had known that Clayton Voss had murdered her father because her father had refused to be moved, and she had known that Voss would come for the ranch next, which he did, arriving 2 weeks after the funeral with documents she had never seen before that purported to show a debt her father owed to a bank in Denver that had somehow secured the ranch as collateral. The documents were forgeries. She had known that too. But the sheriff had sided with Voss, and the judge in the territorial court was the same judge who had been hearing the water rights case, and Lillian had been 22 years old and alone, and suddenly without resources in a world that offered very little protection to women in her circumstances. Bernard had been with her through those terrible weeks after her father's death. He had been a steady, furious, helpless presence at her side. Furious because he saw exactly what Voss was doing and could not stop it through legal means. Helpless because the mechanisms of law and order in Redemption Creek in 1876 had been compromised at every level. He had gone to the federal marshal's office in Denver himself, riding 3 days each way, and had come back with the information that a federal investigation would take months and offered no guarantee of outcome. On the night before she was to be legally removed from the ranch under the fraudulent debt claim, Bernard had come to her in the main house where she was packing what she could carry, and he had told her he had a plan. He had contacts, he said, men he trusted from his time in New Mexico. If she could get herself somewhere safe, if she could disappear for a while, he could gather evidence, could build a case that no corrupt local judge could dismiss, could go to the federal authorities with something concrete. "You want me to run," she had said. "I want you to survive," he had said, "and then come back. And you?" "I will be here," he had said. "I will stay and watch and build the case. And when you come back, we will take back everything that was taken." She had looked at him for a long time in the lamplight of the house her father had built, and she had made the worst and most necessary decision of her life. She had left. She had left with a carpetbag and her mother's silver brooch, and a train ticket to Denver that Bernard had pressed into her hands along with everything in his savings, which was more than she had expected, and which she had never stopped feeling the weight of. She had left without saying properly what she needed to say, because there had not been time, and because she had been afraid that if she said it she would not be able to leave at all. What she had not known, what she had discovered only 2 months later through a letter that took 6 weeks to find her in Kansas City, where she had found work as a seamstress, was that Bernard had been arrested 3 days after she left. Clayton Voss had had him charged with theft, a fabricated charge built on falsified ranch records, and he had spent 4 months in the territorial jail before the charges had been quietly dropped when the evidence proved too obviously manufactured even for the corrupt local system to sustain. By the time she received that letter, she had already been moving. She had not stayed in Kansas City. She had moved to St. Louis and then to Chicago and then back down to Texas, always staying one step ahead of the sense that Voss's reach was longer than it should have been, always gathering what she could, always writing letters to federal offices that answered slowly if they answered at all. 7 years. 7 years of moving and working and fighting through the slow machinery of justice, and in those 7 years she had kept only a few things close: the silver brooch, the memory of her father's laugh, and the knowledge that Bernard Turner had stayed in Redemption Creek because the letters she had sent and the careful inquiries she had made through trusted intermediaries had all confirmed it. He was still there. He had taken work at the Callaway spread east of town after the fraudulent ranch transfer, and he was still there, and she had held that information like a coal in her palm, warm and burning, and impossible to put down. The federal investigation had finally moved in the spring of 1883. A new federal marshal named Hargrove, stationed in Denver, had taken an interest in the pattern of land fraud that Clayton Voss's consortium had perpetrated across 3 territories, and the case that Bernard had begun building in 1876, and that Lillian had added to from her own research over 7 years, had provided enough documentary evidence to launch a formal investigation. Marshal Hargrove had contacted Lillian directly through a Chicago attorney she had retained, had told her that her return to Redemption Creek and her formal testimony would be essential to the prosecution. So she had come back, officially for justice. Unofficially for 1,000 other reasons she was only beginning to admit to herself. And now she was standing in the Silver Horn Saloon holding a photograph that Bernard Turner had kept for 7 years because he had always believed she would return, and the weight of everything between them was pressing down on the moment with a ferocity that made it hard to breathe. "We need to talk," she said. "Somewhere private." He nodded. "My place. I have a house on Ridgeline Road now. It is 15 minutes out of town. I know, she said, and watched something move across his face when he realized she had been keeping track of him across all that distance and all that time. She had arrived in Redemption Creek on the 23rd of May, 1883. She was 29 years old. The town had grown in 7 years, grown and changed in the particular way that frontier towns grew when a railroad line came through, which the Denver and Rio Grande had done in 1880, bringing commerce and settlers and a new layer of permanence over the old rough bones of the place. There were 2 new hotels, 3 new saloons, a proper bank with a stone facade, a schoolhouse, 2 churches, and a telegraph office. The streets were still dirt, still dust in the dry season and mud in the wet, but there was more traffic on them, more voices, more of the busy noise of a town that had decided it was going to endure. Clayton Voss was still there. This was the piece of information that had kept her hand near the small pistol in her carpetbag on the ride in. He had expanded his operation, had purchased the fraudulently seized Lockhart Ranch property, and turned it into a piece of a larger cattle empire. And he was known in Redemption Creek as a successful businessman with friends in the territorial government and a large house on the west side of town. He had a reputation for generosity with some and hardness with others, the carefully managed reputation of a man who understood that how he was perceived was a tool as useful as any other. He did not know yet that a federal investigation was coming. Marshal Hargrove had been explicit about the need for discretion. Lillian's arrival needed to look casual, unexplained, unconnected to any official process. She was to gather what she could locally, confirm what was needed, and testify when the marshal arrived, which would be within 2 weeks. 2 weeks in Redemption Creek with Clayton Voss in the same town, and Bernard Turner 15 minutes down the road, and 7 years of everything pressing against the inside of her chest, was going to be either the most important 2 weeks of her life or the most catastrophic. She suspected it was going to be both. Bernard's house on Ridgeline Road was a modest, solid structure, built of timber from the local mill with a covered porch that faced west toward the mountains. It was clean and spare inside, a man's house rather than a home, with practical furniture and not much in the way of decoration except a good rifle over the door and a small shelf of books near the fireplace. She noticed the books. She had not expected the books. He made coffee on the iron stove while she sat at the kitchen table, and she looked around the room and felt the strangeness of being in this space that was his and that she had never seen before and that somehow felt more familiar than it should. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning. After I left." He brought the coffee to the table and sat across from her and told her. He told her about the arrest, which she already knew about in outline but not in detail, and the telling of it was harder than the knowing had been. 4 months in the territorial jail on a theft charge he had not committed, the humiliation of it, the frustration of it, and then the quiet dropping of the charges when the fabricated evidence became too obvious to sustain. And then the long process of finding work and rebuilding a life in a town where Voss's influence had made him a marked man. He had worked for the Callaway spread for 2 years, he said, and then for the Jefferson brothers for 3 more, and last year he had finally saved enough to put a down payment on a small piece of land of his own, a parcel up near the ridge that he was beginning to run a small herd on. It was modest, he said. Nothing like what he had managed at the Lockhart Ranch, but it was his. "And you stayed," she said. "All this time you could have gone anywhere." He looked at her steadily. "I said I would be here when you came back." "Bernard," she said, and stopped, because she did not know what she was going to say next. There were too many things and none of them were quite right. She had been rehearsing what she would say to him across 7 years and 1,000 miles, and none of it applied now that she was actually sitting across from him in his kitchen with his coffee in her hands. "You do not have to explain anything," he said. "I want to," she said. "I need to." "All right." "I stayed away longer than I should have," she said. "I know that. There were months, probably years, when I could have come back and I did not, and the reason was not entirely practical. Part of it was fear, not of Voss, of this. She gestured between them, a small movement that somehow encompassed everything. Of coming back here and finding that what I remembered was not real, or that it had faded for you the way I was afraid it had not faded for me. He was very still across the table from her, the kind of stillness that was not absence but presence, concentrated. Nothing faded, he said quietly. She looked at her coffee. That is what I was afraid of, she admitted, and then immediately felt the absurdity of being afraid of something so fundamentally good, and then felt the truth underneath the absurdity, which was that she was terrified of loving Bernard Turner fully and completely in a place where Clayton Voss was still walking free and capable of damage. Tell me about the federal case, he said, because he was a practical man who understood the value of sequencing. She told him. She told him about the 7 years of documentation, the letters she had written and the responses she had gathered, the attorney in Chicago, the contact with Marshall Hargrove, the shape of the case against Voss and his consortium. She laid it out precisely, because this was something she was sure of, something she had built carefully and thoroughly over years, and the precision of it steadied her. Bernard listened without interrupting, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment. There is more, he said. More than what you have, she looked at him sharply. What kind of more? He got up from the table and went to the shelf near the fireplace and moved 2 of the books aside, and behind them was a tin box, the kind you kept important papers in, latched and dented and very clearly well handled over the years. He brought it to the table and opened it and laid the contents out carefully. She leaned forward and her breath caught. There were land records. Original land records. The actual territorial documents from the period of the transfer, not copies but originals, with the alterations in the debt documentation visible to anyone who knew what to look for. There were 2 sworn statements from ranch hands who had witnessed things they had been afraid to report at the time, and had since moved on to other territories. There was a letter, in what she recognized as the handwriting of the corrupt local judge, that discussed the arrangement with Voss in terms that were unambiguous and damning. And there was a record of a financial transaction, a transfer of funds from a St. Louis bank to a Redemption Creek account, dated 3 days before her father's death. Where did you get all of this? She whispered. 7 years, he said simply. I had 7 years. She looked up at him and felt the full weight of what he had done, the patient, careful, dangerous work of a man who had stayed in a town where he was watched and distrusted, and had quietly built a case anyway because he had made a promise to a woman who had left and had told her he would be here when she came back. Bernard, she said, and this time she knew what came after his name. Thank you. He looked at her across the table, and the lamplight was warm between them, and she thought about the photograph he had kept in his vest pocket for 7 years, carried next to his heart through everything, and she thought about what that kind of faithfulness meant, the scale of it, the weight of it, the extraordinary and humbling fact of it. Do not thank me yet, he said quietly. Voss does not know you are here. When he finds out, and he will find out, there will be trouble. He has men on his payroll, not just cowboys, men who do the kind of work that does not get written down anywhere. I know, she said. I have been careful. You will need to be more careful than you have ever been, he said. 2 weeks is a long time to stay hidden in a town this size. I am not hiding, she said. I am staying at the Morrison Hotel under my own name. I want him to know I am here. Bernard went very still. Lillian, if I come in quietly and he does not notice me until the marshal arrives, then the element of surprise belongs to the investigation, which is good. But if he does notice me, and he will because men like Voss always notice threats, then I want him to see a woman who has come back for her father's property through legal means. I want him to see something that looks like a simple, manageable problem. Because that is the best cover for what is actually happening. He studied her for a long moment. You have thought about this for a long time. 7 years, she said, and echoed his own words back at him with a small, careful smile that was the first real smile she had offered anyone in as long as she could remember. Something shifted in his face when she smiled. Something that had been held very carefully in reserve moved forward slightly, and she saw it happen, and she did not look away. "All right," he said. "We do it your way, but I am going to be close. You will not be able to stop that." "I know," she said. "I am not going to try." The next morning she went to the Federal Land Office at 9 o'clock and filed a formal complaint regarding the legitimacy of the 1876 transfer of the Lockhart Ranch property, citing irregularities in the debt documentation. She did this openly, visibly, with her own name on every document, because she wanted it on record, and because she wanted Clayton Voss to know immediately. The land office clerk, a nervous young man with ink on his fingers, looked at her papers and then looked at her and then looked at her papers again, and she could see the calculation in his eyes, the awareness that the name Lockhart was connected to something sensitive. "This will take time to process," he said. "I understand," she said pleasantly. "I'm not going anywhere." By that afternoon, word had reached Clayton Voss. She knew it had because she was taking her supper at the hotel dining room when his man came in, a wide, blank-faced individual named Gruder whom she recognized from 7 years earlier when he had been the one who delivered the fraudulent debt papers to the ranch. Gruder looked around the dining room, found her, and looked at her for a moment without expression, then left. She finished her supper without hurrying. Bernard appeared at the hotel 30 minutes later. He did not come to the dining room, which would have been noticed and would have connected them publicly in ways that might complicate the situation. He left a note at the front desk, and she read it upstairs in her room. The note said, "Gruder was asking about your arrival at the land office before he came to the hotel. You have approximately 12 hours before Voss decides on a course of action. I will be at the livery at 6 in the morning if you need to reach me quickly. Burn this." She burned it over the lamp and lay awake for a long time in the unfamiliar hotel bed, thinking about Clayton Voss's dark past, and her father's unfinished justice, and Bernard Turner's gray eyes, and the photograph he had kept next to his heart for 7 years, and eventually she slept. Voss came himself the next morning. She did not expect that. She had expected lawyers or messages, or the carefully managed intermediary pressure of a man who was accustomed to operating through proxies. She did not expect him to walk through the door of the hotel dining room at 8 in the morning while she was having her breakfast and sit down across from her with the smooth, proprietary confidence of a man who owned the room, which in fact he probably did, since he seemed to own a significant portion of Redemption Creek by 1883. He looked older than she remembered. He was 50 or so now, heavyset, with the particular well-fed solidity of a man who had eaten well off other people's labor for many years. His suit was expensive. His watch chain was gold. He set his hat on the table beside him as though she had invited him and smiled at her with a smoothness that made her stomach tighten. "Miss Lockhart," he said, "what a surprise." "Mr. Voss," she said, keeping her voice entirely level, "I would not describe it as a surprise. I filed a legal complaint at the land office yesterday. It is a matter of public record. A complaint based on documents that were thoroughly examined in 1876, he said, and found to be legitimate. Documents that I believe a federal investigation will find rather differently," she said, and watched his face. The smoothness flickered. Just for a moment, just a slight tightening around the eyes, but she saw it and understood that he had not known about the federal angle. He had known she was here, had probably assumed it was the action of a woman who had come back out of sentiment or desperation or both, had not yet factored in the possibility of federal involvement. "You have been busy," he said, and his voice was very measured now, the smoothness reconstituted but slightly more effortful. "I have," she said. 7 years is a long time to prepare." He looked at her for a moment that stretched out too long, and she met his eyes and did not look away, because she was Gerald Lockhart's daughter, and Gerald Lockhart had not looked away from anything in his life. "You should be careful," Voss said, and it was not quite a threat and not quite a warning, and it was entirely both. "I have found," she said pleasantly, That caution is most important for people who have done things they need to hide. He stood up from the table and picked up his hat with a controlled deliberateness that told her exactly how angry he was beneath the smooth surface. "We will settle this through the courts," he said, "as we did before." "Yes," she said, "we will settle it through the courts." Different courts this time. He left, and she waited until his footsteps had crossed the lobby, and the hotel door had closed before she let out a long, slow breath and reached for her coffee with a hand that she was pleased to note was steady. She went to Bernard that morning. She walked out to the livery on the pretense of checking on her roan mare, and he was there as he had said he would be, mending a piece of bridle leather with a practiced patience that was so completely characteristic of him that she felt something loosen in her chest just seeing it. She told him about the breakfast with Voss. He listened, and when she described Voss's face when she mentioned the federal investigation, his expression shifted from careful concern to something that was the closest he visibly came to satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Let him worry. A worried man makes mistakes." "He also makes moves," she said. "He will not sit still now." "No," Bernard agreed. "He will not." He set down the bridle and looked at her with those direct gray eyes. "I want to move the documents, the ones I have been keeping. Somewhere off my property." "Where?" "There is a woman named Agnes Cutter who runs the millinery shop on the main street. She has no connection to me publicly, and she has had her own reasons to dislike Voss since he forced her late husband out of a freighting contract 5 years ago. She will keep them." "You trust her?" "As much as I trust anyone in this town," he said, "which is not a low bar. Agnes Cutter is as straight a person as I know." "All right," she said. "Do it today." He nodded. Then he looked at her for a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she was aware of the livery stable around them, the warm smell of horses and hay and leather, and the particular morning light that came through the wide door. And she was aware of the fact that they were alone together for the first time without the weight of an immediate strategic conversation holding everything at the necessary practical distance. "You look tired," he said, which was not what she expected. "I did not sleep very well," she admitted. "Were you frightened?" She considered the question honestly. "Not frightened exactly. Aware there is a difference." He nodded slowly. "You have changed," he said, and it was not a criticism. It was an observation carefully made and something like respectful. "I am 29 years old," she said. 7 years older than the last time you saw me. Of course I have changed." "You were determined before," he said. "Now you are something else more than determined." "What am I now?" she asked, genuinely curious. He thought about it. "Certain," he said finally. "You are certain. Like you have decided something that cannot be undecided, and everything you do comes from that place." She looked at him for a moment. "And you," she said, "have you changed?" "I am 35 years old," he said. "Yes, I have changed." "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the bridle in his hands. "I used to think patience was a thing you practiced until the right moment, and then you stopped. I understand now that some kinds of patience are permanent, that some things you wait for not because you are sure they will come, but because waiting is the truest thing you can do." The morning light lay across the threshold of the livery door, and the town moved with its ordinary sounds outside, and she felt the 7 years of distance between them collapsing into something much smaller. "I am sorry it took so long," she said. "You are here now," he said simply. The next several days moved with the particular tension of a situation that is building toward something inevitable while requiring constant vigilance in the present moment. Lillian established herself in Redemption Creek with a careful deliberateness, visiting the land office again, speaking with the local attorney she had identified through her Chicago contact as someone not in Voss's pocket, making herself visible and purposeful in a way that announced she was there for legitimate legal reasons and was not going to be frightened off. Bernard moved the documents to Agnes Cutter's millinery shop, as planned. Lillian went in herself the next morning under the pretense of looking at hats, which she did need in any case since her old bonnet had given up on its ambitions somewhere in Kansas, and she met Agnes, who was a sharp-eyed woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and hands that showed 40 years of careful work. Agnes looked at Lillian with an assessment that was quick and thorough and then said, "Your father was a good man. I remember him from the early days." "Yes," Lillian said. "He was." "What you are doing is right," Agnes said. "The way practical women in hard countries sometimes said the most important things, plainly and without ornamentation. Those papers are safe with me." "Thank you," Lillian said, and meant it with her whole heart. She bought a hat. It was a respectable dark blue with a practical brim, which seemed appropriate for a woman engaged in a legal battle in the high summer of a Colorado Territory town. On the fourth day, Voss made his move. It was not as dramatic as she had feared, but it was threatening in the particular way of a man who knew how to use systems to harm people. He filed a counter-complaint at the land office, claiming that her return and her filing represented harassment and a bad faith legal action, and he cited 3 witnesses who were prepared to testify to the legitimacy of the original 1876 debt documents. She read the counter-complaint at the land office and felt cold clarity settle over her, which was not the same as fear. That evening she sent a telegram to Marshal Hargrove in Denver. The telegram said, "Move to action. Request earliest possible arrival. Lockhart." The reply came the next morning and said, "Arrive Wednesday. Maintain position. Hargrove." Wednesday was 5 days away. She went to Bernard that evening, and for the first time since she had returned, she did not go because of the case. She went because she was tired, and the tiredness was the kind that strategy and planning could not address. The deep, accumulated tiredness of having been alone with something enormous for a very long time, and she needed to sit somewhere with someone who knew the full weight of it. He opened the door when she knocked and did not ask why she had come, just stepped back to let her in and went to the stove and put water on for coffee without being asked. She sat at his kitchen table and watched him move around the small kitchen with an ease that was comfortable and intimate in ways that felt both new and very old, and she thought about how strange and how profoundly right it was to be in this room. "He filed a counter-complaint," she said. "I heard," he said, "3 witnesses who will lie for him. 5 more days until the marshal arrives." "5 days is manageable," he said. He brought the coffee and sat across from her. "Are you all right?" "I am managing," she said. "That is not what I asked." She looked at him. "No," she admitted, "not entirely. I am holding too many things at once, and I have been doing it alone for a long time, and sometimes the weight of it is considerable." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers where it rested on the table. Not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration, just a hand placed over hers with a steadiness that said, "You are not alone in this. Not tonight. Not anymore." She looked down at his hand and then up at him and felt the full, complicated, overwhelming reality of loving this man, of having loved him across 7 years and 1,000 miles, and every hard thing, the persistence of it, the stubbornness of her own heart. "Bernard," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "I need to say it," she said. "All right. I love you," she said, and saying it after 7 years felt like setting down something very heavy that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten she was carrying it at all. "I loved you when I left, and I have loved you every day since, and I am sorry that I was so afraid of it that I could not say it before I left. I should have said it." His hand tightened on hers. "You say it now," he said. "I say it now," she agreed. The firelight was warm. Outside, the May night was cool, and the sound of the creek carried faintly on the breeze through the open window. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were the color of the mountains before a storm and after a storm, and in some ways most essentially themselves, and she thought that this moment, this exact moment, had been waiting for 7 years and had not lost a single thing in the waiting. "I love you," he said, and the words in his voice were as plain and solid and permanent as the man himself. "I have loved you since that walk back from the North Pasture in October of 1875, when you told me you knew how to walk a lame horse, and I thought you were the finest person I had ever met." She laughed, a small, surprised sound that she had not expected to make. You fell in love with me because I was irritable about horse management. I fell in love with you, he said, because you were competent and direct and not afraid to be sharp when you thought I was being condescending, and you were right to be sharp because I was being condescending, and I thought, there is a woman who knows exactly who she is. She looked at him across the table with his hand on hers and the firelight between them, and felt something in her chest that had been braced against itself for 7 years begin, very slowly and carefully, to open. He did not kiss her that night. It was not the moment for it, not quite, and Bernard Turner was a man who understood the value of the right moment, who understood that some things needed to be fully prepared for rather than rushed. He walked her back to town at the end of the evening, riding beside her on his own horse, and left her at the hotel door with a look that carried everything that had been said between them and a great deal that had not been said yet, and that could wait. She slept better that night than she had slept in years. The crisis came on day 3 of the 5, which was a Tuesday, which meant it came 2 days before Marshal Hargrove was due to arrive, and at a moment when the situation was most fragile. She was at the attorney's office reviewing her documentation when Gruder came again, this time not alone but with 2 other men she did not recognize, and he came into the attorney's office without knocking and told her in a flat, unhurried voice that Mr. Voss would like to have a conversation. She looked at the attorney, whose name was Samuel Holt, and who was a competent and decent man, but who was not, evidently, prepared for 3 large men in his office without warning. "This is not an appropriate way to arrange a meeting," she said to Gruder. "Mr. Voss is not always particular about ways and means," Gruder said, in a tone that was almost bored. "I have nothing to say to Mr. Voss that cannot be said through proper legal channels," she said, "which is where I have been conducting this entire matter. You may tell him that." There was a pause that she did not like. It was the kind of pause in which men were deciding something about what kind of situation this was going to become. "Miss Lockhart," said Gruder. "You should leave," said a voice from the doorway. She turned. Bernard was standing in the attorney's office doorway, and his particular quality of stillness was very present, the focused, unhurried stillness of a man who has assessed a situation completely and has decided exactly what he is prepared to do about it. Gruder looked at Bernard. Bernard looked at Gruder. The 2 other men looked at each other. "Turner," said Gruder. "I will say it once more," Bernard said. "You should leave." He was not holding a weapon. He did not need to be. There was something in the way he stood, the way he occupied space, that communicated very clearly that removing him from this situation would be a project requiring more effort than was currently worth the investment. Gruder made a calculation. She could see it happening behind his blank face. "Mr. Voss wanted a conversation," Gruder said finally. "Tell Mr. Voss," Bernard said, "that the lady's schedule does not currently accommodate private conversations. Tell him she will be happy to discuss matters when the relevant federal authorities arrive." The words "federal authorities" did their work. Gruder's blank expression acquired a very slight quality of reconsideration. "We will be in touch," Gruder said, and left with his 2 companions, and the attorney's office door closed behind them. Lillian looked at Bernard. "How did you know I was here?" "Agnes saw Gruder heading this way," he said. "She sent her shop boy." "You have been watching," she said. "I said I would be close," he said. "I meant it." She felt a complicated rush of things, gratitude and relief, and something warmer underneath both. "You mentioned the federal authorities deliberately." "Yes. Voss will move now. Tonight perhaps he will want to do something before Wednesday." "I know," Bernard said, "which is why you are not going back to the hotel tonight." "Bernard, Agnes has a guest room," he said. "It is the last place anyone would think to look for you, and Agnes Cutter is entirely capable of managing the situation if anyone comes asking. You know I am right." She did know he was right. She did not entirely like it, the feeling of being managed, of having the situation require management, but she was a practical woman and practicality required acknowledging when someone was correct. "Fine," she said. "Agnes's." "Good." She looked at him for a moment. You could have been hurt just now if they had decided not to back down. He met her eyes steadily. Yes, he said simply, as though this were a fully acceptable fact. Be careful, she said, and the words felt inadequate for what she meant. Always, he said, and the word in his voice meant, I intend to be here when this is over. That night, Voss made his move, and it was not the kind of move she had anticipated. He did not come after her directly. He went after Bernard. She learned this at 2 in the morning when Agnes woke her with a knock on the guest room door and a lamp held up to show an expression that was serious and careful rather than frightened, because Agnes Cutter was not the frightening kind. There is a young man downstairs, Agnes said, a ranch hand from the Calloway place. He says there was trouble at Bernard Turner's property tonight. Says some men came and there was a fire in the small barn. She was dressed and downstairs in 4 minutes. The ranch hand, a young man of about 20 named Percy, told her quickly and without embellishment that a group of 3 or 4 riders had come to Bernard's place around midnight, that there had been a confrontation, that the small barn where Bernard kept his feed and equipment had been set alight, and that Bernard was unharmed but the barn was a total loss, and the sheriff had not been called because the local sheriff was still the kind of man who wore expensive new boots. "Where is Bernard?" she demanded. "He sent me here, ma'am," Percy said. "He said to tell you he is fine and to tell you to stay put and not do anything precipitous." She was already heading for the door. "Ma'am," Percy said, following. "He specifically said not to." "I heard what he specifically said," she told Percy. "Get a horse." She rode out to Ridgeline Road in the dark with Percy doing his best to keep up and arrived at Bernard's place to find the barn a smoking ruin and Bernard standing in the yard watching it with the particular expression of a man who is doing several things at once internally while keeping his face very still. He turned when he heard her come up the drive and looked at her for a moment. "I told Percy to tell you to stay put," he said. "Percy delivered the message accurately," she said, dismounting. "And you came anyway." "Bernard," she said, and crossed the yard to him. And the calculation she had been making about timing and appropriate moments was overridden entirely by the fact that he was standing there in the firelight of his burned barn with ash on his shirt and soot on his hands, and an expression that was trying very hard to be okay and was mostly succeeding. And she was not willing to be on the other side of any distance from him anymore. Not tonight. She took his face in her hands and kissed him, and he made a sound low in his throat that was surprise and relief and something that had been waiting a very long time. And then his arms came around her and he kissed her back with a thoroughness that communicated very clearly that he had also spent a significant amount of time thinking about this. "Your barn," she said when she could speak again, "is a barn," he said firmly. "I will build another one. He did this to warn you." "I know what he did it for," Bernard said. "He does not want us talking to each other. He is afraid of what we have between us, and he should be." "2 more days," she said. "2 more days," he agreed. His arms were still around her, and she was still close, and neither of them was moving away from that position, which struck her as entirely correct under the circumstances. "Come stay in the house tonight," he said. "It is safer than the road back, and Agnes is not the only one with a guest room." She stayed. She slept in the small, plain guest room at the back of the house with the window latched and her little pistol on the nightstand. And despite the urgency of everything, she slept deeply and well. Because there was something about being under the same roof as Bernard Turner that her body understood as safe in a way that no other place had felt in 7 years. In the morning she went back to Agnes's house through the quiet early streets, and from Agnes's she sent a second telegram to Marshal Hargrove that said only, "Voss moving. Be aware." Wednesday came with the particular quality of a day that has been waited for, and that arrives with the slightly anticlimactic reality of an actual morning, rather than the grand event it has been in the imagination. Marshal Hargrove arrived on the afternoon train from Denver, a lean, sandy-haired man of about 40, with a calm efficiency that she found immediately reassuring. He arrived with 2 deputy marshals, both professional and unobtrusive, and they met at the hotel in the early evening with Bernard and Lillian and the attorney Samuel Holt. Hargrove examined everything. The documents from Bernard's tin box, now in Agnes Cutter's millinery shop, Lillian's 7 years of accumulated evidence, the sworn statements, the financial records. He examined it all with the methodical attention of a man who had spent years building cases and understood what would hold in a federal court and what would not. "This," he said at last, looking at the letter from the corrupt judge, "is extraordinary. How did you get this?" "Patience," Bernard said. "And some luck," Hargrove admitted. "This alone is worth 3 times what we had going in. With everything here, we have a solid case." "When do you move?" Lillian asked. "Tomorrow morning," Hargrove said. "We will arrest Voss at his house before breakfast, before he has time to prepare or disappear. His men, including Gruder, will be taken simultaneously by my deputies." "And the corrupt sheriff?" Bernard asked. "Will be suspended pending investigation," Hargrove said. "We have enough on his arrangement with Voss to make that stick." Lillian looked at Bernard across the table and felt the culmination of 7 years pressing up against the present moment with a force that was almost physical. The next morning she stood on the main street of Redemption Creek in the early light and watched Marshal Hargrove and his deputies ride toward the west side of town, where Voss's large house sat behind its pretentious fence. And she felt the weight of everything she had been carrying for 7 years and thought about her father, who had never gotten to see this morning. Bernard stood beside her. He did not take her hand in the street, because he was a private man and this was a public place, but he stood close enough that she could feel his presence as a warmth against the morning cool, and that was enough. They arrested Clayton Voss at 7 in the morning. Gruder was taken at the Silver Horn Saloon, where he apparently started his mornings early. 2 other men were taken at the livery and at the hotel respectively. The corrupt sheriff, whose name was Dalton and who had bought his expensive boots with Voss's money, was informed of his suspension by a deputy who handed him the official federal notice with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time to deliver it. The town was very quiet for several hours after. Then it began to talk, the way towns talk when something significant has happened, in clusters on street corners and in saloons and over fences, with the rapid, excited energy of people processing a surprise that upon reflection was not entirely a surprise. Lillian sat with Bernard on the bench outside the land office and let the morning move around her. She felt hollowed out in a way that was not unpleasant, the particular emptiness of having put down something very heavy and not yet adjusted to the absence of the weight. "Is it over?" she said. "The arrest is over," Bernard said. "The court case will take months. Will he be convicted? With what we have?" Bernard looked at her steadily. "Yes, I believe so. And the ranch land, my father's land, that will be part of the recovery process," he said. "It will take time through the courts, but with Hargrove involved and the federal case proceeding, the fraudulent transfer should be reversible. The land should come back." She looked out at the street where Redemption Creek was conducting its extraordinary, ordinary day. "My father built that ranch from nothing," she said. "He came west with $20 and stubbornness, and he built something real and lasting. I want it back, not just for me, for him." "We will get it back," Bernard said, and the "we" was deliberate and significant. She looked at him. "We," she said. "If that is agreeable to you," he said, with a careful formality that was his version of nervousness, which she found profoundly endearing. "Bernard Turner," she said, "we have spent 7 years on opposite ends of a very long distance doing the same thing, which was building a case to bring down a man who murdered my father and stole our land. I believe we have established that we work very well together." "I believe we have," he said gravely, though his eyes were warm. "So yes," she said, "we." The months that followed were not without difficulty. Federal cases in 1883 moved through the territorial court system at their own unhurried pace, and the trial of Clayton Voss was not scheduled until October. There were depositions and legal filings, and the specific frustration of watching justice, proceed in a language that was legal rather than moral, correct in form, while dealing with something that had been deeply wrong in substance. But Lillian had waited 7 years. She could wait until October. She spent those months in Redemption Creek. She took rooms at the Morrison Hotel initially, and then, at Agnes Cutter's very practical suggestion, she took rooms at Agnes's house, which were comfortable and reasonably priced and came with the benefit of Agnes's company, which was sharp and amusing and frequently exactly what was needed. She visited Bernard at Ridgeline Road. She rode out in the mornings, and they drank coffee on the porch that faced the mountains and talked about the case and about other things, smaller things, the kind of ordinary daily things that people who are building a life together talk about. He was rebuilding his small barn with timber from the local mill. She helped where she could, which he accepted without making a production of it, because Bernard was not the kind of man who felt his competence was threatened by a capable woman, which she found deeply restful. They rode together in the evenings when the day's work allowed, out through the tall grass of the valley, and up toward the red canyon walls that had always been the most beautiful thing about the landscape around Redemption Creek. They talked and were sometimes silent in the comfortable way of people who do not need to fill every moment with sound. They told each other things they had not told anyone else, about the years of separation and what they had been, about the small and large ways they had held each other in mind across the distance. He told her about the nights in the territorial jail, how he had spent those 4 months making careful mental notes of everything he observed, using the forced inactivity as time to think through every aspect of what Voss had done and how to document it. He told her about the years of patient watching and gathering that had followed, about the risks he had taken to obtain certain documents, risks that made her want to reach back across time and protect him from them, even though they had been necessary, and had produced the results that were now bringing Voss to justice. She told him about her years in Kansas City and St. Louis and Chicago, the seamstress work and the attorney contact, and the federal letters that had gone unanswered for years before finally finding ears that were willing to listen. She told him about the particular loneliness of a long-term purpose, the way having something to work toward kept you going, but also kept you at a remove from anything else, from the ordinary warmth of a life that was not entirely defined by a single goal. "I was afraid," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun go down behind the mountains in a lavender and gold blaze that made the whole world look briefly like something from a painting, not of Voss. "Of coming back and finding that the thing between us had been something I had made larger in my memory than it actually was, that I had been carrying a love that had only existed in full on my side." He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair. "And now," he said, "now I am embarrassed by how unnecessary that particular fear was," she said. He laughed, a quiet sound that she had been collecting all summer like currency, because Bernard's laughter was not a common event and was therefore more valuable when it occurred. "We are very similar in some ways," he said, "both of us afraid of the wrong things." "What were you afraid of?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "That you had found something in those 7 years that made coming back here something you would choose not to do," he said. "Not because of Voss. Because you had built a different life, a better one, that did not have a place in it for a man holding a photograph in a frontier town and waiting. There was no better life," she said. "There was only the one I was supposed to have, and I was on the wrong side of the distance from it." He looked at her sideways in the evening light, and the warmth in his expression was something she thought she could spend a very long time looking at without becoming accustomed to it. The trial of Clayton Voss began on the 12th of October, 1883, in the federal court in Denver. She testified for 2 days. It was not comfortable. Voss's attorney was skilled and relentless, and tried every angle he could find to undermine her credibility, her age at the time of events, the gap in time since they had occurred, the fact that she had left the territory rather than remaining to contest the transfer. She answered every question clearly and factually, and without giving him anything he could use, because she had been preparing for this testimony for 7 years, and she knew the material better than anyone in the room. Bernard testified as well, for 3 days, presenting the documentary evidence with a methodical precision that Marshall Hargrove told her afterward was the most effective testimony he had seen in 20 years of federal work. The financial records, the forged debt documents, the judge's letter, the sworn statements of the former ranch hands were each entered into evidence and explained in clear terms that the jury of 12 men could follow without legal expertise. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned a guilty verdict on all primary counts, including fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and complicity in the death of Gerald Lockhart. She was sitting in the gallery when the verdict was read, and she held herself very still and felt the 7 years of everything press through her in a single enormous breath. And then it was over and she was crying, quietly, which was the first time she had cried in front of another living soul in all that time, and she did not entirely mind it. Bernard's hand closed around hers in the gallery, and she turned her face briefly against his shoulder, and then she straightened up and wiped her eyes with practical efficiency, and looked at the front of the courtroom where Clayton Voss was being remanded into federal custody, and she thought about her father. "He would be pleased," Bernard said quietly beside her. "Yes," she said, "he would." Clayton Voss was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. Dalton, the corrupt sheriff, was charged separately with dereliction of duty and acceptance of bribes and received a 5-year sentence. The recovery of the Lockhart Ranch property moved through the federal courts with the momentum of the successful criminal case behind it. And in January of 1884, a federal court order restored legal title to the Lockhart Ranch to Lillian Lockhart as the sole surviving heir of Gerald Lockhart. She stood in the federal land office in Denver when the restored title was placed in her hands and felt the weight of it, the particular beautiful weight of something real and lasting returned to its rightful place. Bernard was standing beside her. He had been in Denver for the proceedings, had ridden up from Redemption Creek on the train the day before. "It is yours," he said. "It is ours," she said, and corrected herself calmly and without hesitation. "Or it will be, if you will have me." He looked at her, she looked at him. The federal land office was not the most romantic setting she could have chosen for this conversation, which she had been moving toward for months, and which had arrived now of its own accord rather than in the planned manner she had vaguely imagined. "I think," he said carefully, "that this is traditionally the moment where I do the asking." "Traditionally," she agreed. "You may proceed if you prefer." He took her hand with a formality that was also completely sincere, the particular combination that was entirely Bernard, and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "Lillian Lockhart," he said, "I have loved you for 8 years, which is approximately 7 years and 11 months longer than it took me to know that I would. I would like to spend the rest of my considerable life with you, on your father's land, building the kind of thing that endures. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without a single moment of hesitation, because there had been enough hesitation between them already, enough carefully maintained distance, and she was finished with all of that. He kissed her there in the federal land office in Denver, Colorado Territory, on a January afternoon in 1884, while the clerk at the desk behind them became very interested in his paperwork, and she kissed him back with her whole heart. They were married in Redemption Creek in March of 1884, in the church that had been built while she was away. A small ceremony attended by Agnes Cutter and Percy the ranch hand and Samuel Holt the attorney, and a number of people from town who had watched with interest the return of Lillian Lockhart and the long, patient faithfulness of Bernard Turner, and who were collectively pleased to see it resolved in the expected direction. Bernard wore his best coat, dark and well-fitted, and had his hair cut for the occasion, and she stood beside him in the dress she had made herself over the winter from good dark blue wool, because she had always been practical even when she was happy, and looked at him at the altar, and thought that she had spent a great deal of the past 7 years being afraid of things that turned out to be unnecessary, and was resolved to spend the next 7, and the 7 after that, and all the 7s that followed, being afraid of considerably less. They rode out to the ranch that same afternoon. The Lockhart Ranch, the valley spread and the red canyon walls and the cold river that fed everything green. It had been poorly managed in the years of Voss's ownership, some fencing in poor repair, one of the outbuildings needing significant work, the main house dusty and closed feeling from years of being used as a work premises rather than a home. But the bones of it were exactly as she remembered, solid and right, her father's work visible in every post and beam. She stood in the yard in her good wool dress and looked at the valley spread before her, and felt Gerald Lockhart's $20 and his stubbornness, and his 25 years of labor all around her, in the land and the structures and the cold, clean air. "It needs work," Bernard said beside her. "Everything worth having does," she said. He looked at her with a warmth that was also amusement. Spoken like a woman who has been working on something worth having for 7 years. 8 years, she said, and the 8 years included him. They spent the spring and summer of 1884 rebuilding what needed rebuilding. They hired 4 hands, including Percy, who transferred from the Callaway place with something approaching enthusiasm, and they began restocking the cattle herd with the kind of methodical patience that Bernard brought to every undertaking. Agnes Cutter visited on Sundays and brought pie and opinions in roughly equal measure, both of which were welcome. The house came alive again. She scrubbed and aired and refurnished, finding pieces at the general store and the occasional traveling merchant, and brought her mother's silver brooch out of its 7 years of carpetbag residence, and pinned it to the mantelpiece in a place where the morning light would catch it. Bernard built new bookshelves in the main room and filled them, a project he approached with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, and she added her own books to them, and the combined result was something that pleased her deeply. In the evenings they sat together on the porch that faced west, the porch her father had built, and watched the mountains go through their daily theater of light and shadow, and talked about the ranch and the cattle and the things that needed doing, and about other things entirely, and sometimes about nothing at all, sitting in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have fought very hard to be in the same place and know better than most how to value the peace of it. By November she was expecting their first child. She told Bernard at supper on a Tuesday evening in a manner that was direct and unembellished, because she was Lillian Lockhart, and she did not approach significant things with theatrical indirection. She simply told him and watched his face. He was very still for a moment. Then something moved across his expression that she had not seen there before, something that was enormous and quiet and completely unguarded, a man without any of his usual careful reserve, just fully present in the fact of what she had told him. He reached across the supper table and took her hands and held them. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing he said, not congratulations. Not excitement, though the excitement was visible underneath the question. The first thing was concern for her. She loved him so thoroughly in that moment that it was almost dizzying. "I am perfectly well," she said. "The ranch work agrees with me." "We will get help," he said immediately. "Bernard," she said, "I am expecting a child, not becoming an invalid. I will tell you when I need help." He looked at her with that familiar combination of admiration and exasperation that she had come to understand was the particular expression he reserved for her most characteristic moments. "You will actually tell me," he said. "You will not simply manage everything independently and inform me of the results when they are already complete." "I will attempt," she said carefully, "to be somewhat more communicative than I have been historically. This is not a guarantee. It is an intention." He laughed and she laughed, and the supper went cold because neither of them particularly cared about supper. Their son was born in June of 1885, on a morning when the valley was full of tall grass, and the creek was running high from the spring melt, and everything in the world seemed to be in the process of becoming. They named him Gerald Bernard Turner for her father and for his own father, who had been a good man in Ohio, and whom Bernard had not seen in 10 years, and whom he wrote a letter to that same evening with the very particular joy of a man who has something excellent to report. Gerald Bernard Turner was a loud, definitive child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn mouth, and he announced his presence in the world with an enthusiasm that no one in a 50-yard radius could be uncertain about. Bernard held him that first morning with an expression that Lillian decided she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The same enormous, unguarded quality she had seen on his face when she told him she was expecting, but even more so distilled to its pure form. A man who had spent years in patient faithfulness finding himself holding the evidence of everything that patience had been building toward. "He looks like your father," Bernard said, looking at the baby. "He has your eyes," she said. Gerald's eyes were gray too, Bernard said thoughtfully. "Maybe that is appropriate." She looked at her son and thought about her father's laugh and the $20 and the stubbornness and the Red Canyon walls, and she thought that Gerald Lockhart would have loved Redemption Creek on a June morning with the creek running high and a grandson in the world with his name. "Yes," she said, "I think it is." The years that settled in after were good years, full and rich in the particular way of years that are built on the right foundation. The ranch grew steadily under Bernard's management and her involvement, because she was not a woman who stood on the sideline of something she had spent 7 years fighting to get back. They ran a good operation, honest and careful, and increasingly profitable as the cattle market expanded with the railroad access that had transformed the territory. Redemption Creek grew too, grew into something that was approaching a proper town rather than a frontier settlement, with a real newspaper by 1887 and a second school, and the kind of civic life that builds up slowly and then seems to have been there all along. Agnes Cutter's millinery shop expanded into a proper dress goods store, and Agnes herself became something of a fixture in the town's social fabric, attending every public event and having opinions about all of them that she was never reluctant to share. Samuel Holt, the attorney, became a friend, the kind of friend who visited on occasional evenings and played chess with Bernard and argued pleasantly about territorial politics and stayed for supper without anyone being formal about it. He was a bachelor who found the company of the Turner household congenial, and the company of the Turner household found his congenial, and the arrangement suited everyone. In 1887, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara, for Lillian's mother, and she proved to be a quieter child than her brother, but not in any way a smaller presence, with the particular quality of a person who observes everything and says little, and can therefore be entirely unexpected when she chooses to be. Gerald, by age 2, had already developed opinions about horses that were strong enough to require management, and Bernard spent a notable portion of his time in those years walking alongside a small, determined person who wanted to be near every horse on the property, and had very little patience for being told that the larger ones were not yet appropriate for a child of 2. "He comes by it honestly," Bernard said one morning, watching Gerald standing at the fence of the pasture looking at the horses with an expression of intense intention. "He does," Lillian agreed. "From both sides." She watched Bernard watching their son and felt the particular sweetness of a life that had been built through difficulty and was therefore genuinely appreciated, not taken for granted in the way that easier lives can be, but understood for what it had cost and what it was worth. The photograph lived on the mantelpiece now, beside her mother's silver brooch. She had taken it out of his vest pocket and framed it in a small wooden frame that she had found in town, and placed it there where the morning light would catch it alongside the brooch. He had noticed and had not said anything about it, which was itself a kind of saying. One morning in the autumn of 1888, she found him on the porch before sunrise, sitting with his coffee and looking at the valley that was just beginning to come out of the dark. She brought her own coffee and sat beside him, and looked at what he was looking at. The valley in the early gray was a quiet and beautiful thing, the grass heavy with dew, the creek a sound rather than a sight yet, the canyon walls beginning to take on definition as the sky lightened in the east. "I have been thinking," he said, in the unhurried way of a man who has been sitting with a thought for some time and has decided it is ready. "Tell me," she said. "I have been thinking about how I would have answered if you had asked me in the autumn of 1876, on the day you left, whether any of this was possible." He was quiet for a moment. "The ranch, you hear, Gerald and Clara, all of it. What would you have said?" she asked. "I would have said that I believed it was possible," he said. "Not that I was certain, but that I believed it." He glanced at her sideways. "I have always been better at believing in things that are not yet visible than at accepting their absence as permanent." She thought of the photograph in his vest pocket, carried for 7 years. "I kept this for you," he had said, "because I always believed you would come back here." She had known the moment he said it, in the Silver Horn Saloon on that May evening in 1883, that it was not a simple statement of fact. It was the entire architecture of how he had survived the 7 years, the faith he had kept in something that he could not be certain of but refused to relinquish. The photograph was not a memento. It was a daily act of will, a choice made every morning to believe in something that had not yet arrived. She reached across and put her hand on his where it rested on his coffee cup. "I am sorry I made you believe for so long," she said. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it. "You came back," he said. "That is the part that matters." The valley was becoming visible now, the grass going from gray to green in the growing light, the canyon walls blushing towards red. The sound of the creek was clearer. Somewhere behind them in the house she could hear the first stirring sounds of Gerald beginning his morning, which meant that very shortly there would be considerably more noise and the quiet of the pre-dawn porch would give way to the cheerful chaos of a family at breakfast. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Staying, when you could have gone anywhere?" "No," he said, without hesitation. "This was where the thing I was waiting for was going to arrive." "You cannot wait for something in the wrong place." She looked at him in the growing morning light, this man who had kept her photograph in his vest pocket for 7 years, and built a case on the edge of danger, and stayed in a town that watched him with suspicion, because he had made a promise, who had waited not with the desperate urgency of someone who cannot sustain uncertainty, but with the deep-rooted patience of someone who has decided that a thing is worth whatever it requires. "I love you," she said. "Have I mentioned that recently?" "This morning is the first time," he said gravely. "It has been a full hour since waking." "An oversight," she said. "Considerable," he agreed. She leaned over and kissed him in the autumn morning light on the porch her father had built, with the valley coming to life around them, and the canyon walls going red, and the sound of their son's voice beginning to carry from inside the house, and felt the extraordinary, ordinary perfection of it, the life that had been won back and built up and was now simply, beautifully, being lived. Gerald appeared at the porch door in his nightshirt with his father's gray eyes wide, and his mother's stubborn expression firmly in place. "Horses," he said, which at 3 years old was his most effective single-word argument. "After breakfast," Bernard said in the calm, unhurried tone that worked considerably better on Gerald than Lillian's more direct approach. "After breakfast," Gerald repeated, as though establishing this as a binding agreement, and went back inside, apparently satisfied with the terms. Bernard looked at Lillian. She looked at Bernard. "He negotiates well," she said. "He comes by it honestly," Bernard said, "from both sides." She laughed, and the morning light was perfect, and the valley was green and gold, and the canyon walls were the color of good rust, and somewhere inside Clara was waking up, and the coffee was still warm, and everything that had been taken and lost and fought for and waited for was here now, present, solid, real, and enduring. The Lockhart ranch ran well into the 1890s. Bernard's careful management and Lillian's sharp business instincts made them a stable and profitable operation, not the largest in the territory, but among the most respected. known for honest dealing and quality cattle, and the kind of consistency that comes from people who do not take what they have for granted. Gerald Turner, named for the grandfather he had never met, grew up with the canyon walls and the cold creek and his mother's books and his father's patience, and turned into a young man who was quietly remarkable in ways that both surprised and did not surprise his parents, because both of them had enough self-knowledge to recognize where the remarkable parts came from. Clara Turner grew up observing everything and saying the precise right thing at the precise right moment, a skill that proved more useful than any single talent Lillian could identify, and which she was fairly certain had been developed partly as an adaptive response to having an older brother with strong opinions about horses. Agnes Cutter's store became one of the landmarks of Redemption Creek, and Agnes herself lived to a vigorous 82, having opinions about everything up to and including the moment she decided she was done having opinions, which she reportedly announced to her niece on a Tuesday morning with characteristic directness. The Clayton Voss case was cited in subsequent federal actions against similar land fraud operations across 3 territories, and Marshall Hargrove, who remained in contact with Lillian for years, mentioned in an 1889 letter that the documentation from the Lockhart case had been used as a template for building 2 subsequent prosecutions that had also resulted in convictions. There was a particular satisfaction in that, in the knowledge that the 7 years of patient work had created something larger than itself, had helped protect others from the same kind of harm. The photo stayed on the mantelpiece. It stayed there through everything, through the seasons and the years and the particular passage of time that a life well lived consists of, through Gerald's first horse and Clara's first book, and the slow, good accumulation of all the ordinary, extraordinary things that happen when 2 people who love each other are building something together. One evening when the children were older, when Gerald was 12 and Clara was 10, and the valley outside the window was deep in a winter that had settled in with comfortable permanence, Clara found the photograph and looked at it carefully with her mother's assessing eyes. "That is you," she said to Lillian, "when you were young." "When I was 22, Lillian said. "Yes." "Where did it come from?" Bernard, sitting by the fire with a book, looked up. Lillian looked at him. He looked back with that steady, gray-eyed calm that had never changed, not in all the years. "Your father kept it," she said, "for 7 years while I was away." Clara considered this. "Why?" she asked. Lillian looked at Bernard. He looked at her. "Because he always believed I would come back," she said. Clara turned the photograph over in her hands and then placed it back carefully on the mantelpiece beside the silver brooch, with the natural precision of a child who understands that certain things belong exactly where they are. "That is a good reason," Clara said, and went back to her own book with the satisfying certainty of someone who has received a complete and sufficient answer. Gerald, sprawled on the rug near the fire with the concentration of a boy whose reading ambitions always exceeded his available time, said without looking up, "Do you think the Hendersons will sell the north pasture in spring?" Bernard and Lillian looked at each other over the heads of their children and the fire and the books and the photograph on the mantelpiece, and they were both quietly, completely, irreversibly happy. "We will have that conversation in the morning," Bernard said to Gerald. "It is an important conversation," Gerald said. "Everything important can wait for morning," Lillian said. "Go to sleep." Gerald went asleep. Clara went to sleep. The fire burned down to warm coals. The valley outside the windows was silver and still under the winter stars. Bernard came and stood behind her where she was still sitting by the dying fire and put his hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and put her hands over his. 8 years ago tomorrow," he said. She counted. He was right. Tomorrow would be 8 years from the day she had walked into the Silver Horn Saloon and seen his back at the bar and known, in the traitorous and accurate way of the heart, exactly why she had really come back. 8 years, she said. "And 7 before that," he said, "which makes 15. "That is a great many years to love one person," she said. "It is," he agreed. I have found it entirely worth the investment." She turned in her chair and looked up at him in the firelight and thought about every version of this moment that had existed in her imagination over the years, all the ways she had pictured it, and found that the reality was better than any of them because it was real, because he was real and she was real, and the children sleeping in their rooms and the ranch outside and the valley and the mountains were all real, and there was nothing more worth having than the real thing. 15 more, she said. And then 15 more after that, he said. Ambitious, she said. Always, he said. She took his hand and held it, and the fire settled. And outside, the winter stars held their positions with the permanent patience of things that have always been there and will always be there. And inside the house on the Lockhart Ranch in the valley, east of Redemption Creek, everything was warm and whole and enduring, built on the foundation of a love that had survived every hard thing the world had thrown at it, and had come out the other side stronger and more certain than ever. The way the truly best things always do.